Today we will attempt to understand what Russia was like before the start of World War I and why a revolution took place in Russia. Russia was a vast empire that was ruled by the Romanov family for 4 centuries. Nicholas II was crowned the Tsar of Russia in 1894. When he was crowned the Tsar, a huge crowd had gathered at the capital to witness the momentous event. The people cheered and called Nicholas the little father of Russia. Just 23 years after he came into power, Nicholas had lost his popularity and was forced to abdicate from power. Why and how did such a thing happen? Before we can attempt to understand why the Tsar was overthrown, let us understand what Russian society was like. Russia was divided into social classes. At the bottom of Russian society were the peasants who made up almost 80% of Russia's population. Living and working conditions for most peasants were dreadful. Starvation was common, and many peasants died. This was largely due to the fact that much of the land in Russia was unsuitable for farming, and many peasants were using traditional methods of farming. Therefore, many peasants suffered from food shortage, starvation, and poverty. The workers too suffered in Russia. The aristocrats and nobles who formed the upper class of Russian society owned about 25% of the land. The aristocrats and nobles led a luxurious lifestyle. The Tsar was not an enlightened leader who cared for the well-being of his people. He was obsessed with the glorious past of his family and believed in having absolute power. He used the army and the secret police to get rid of his opponents. He killed anyone who opposed him. Nicholas was not an able and forceful leader. He tended to avoid making important decisions. He felt threatened by capable and talented men, and more often than not, dismissed them. He also practiced nepotism, appointing family members and friends from the court to key positions. Many of them were incompetent and corrupt. Naturally, they did nothing to help the people of Russia. By 1903, there was a great deal of opposition to the Tsar's rule. In 1905, the suffering peasants and workers decided to appeal to the Tsar for help. A crowd of 200,000 unarmed protesters carrying the Tsar's pictures to show him respect marched to the Winter Palace. They wanted to hand him a petition. The Tsar left the palace at the first sign of trouble, leaving his soldiers with the order to shoot down the unarmed protesters. The Tsar lost the respect and what little support he had from the people. Revolts and uprising took place following this disaster known as the Bloody Sunday incident. It looked as though the Tsar would lose control of Russia. To appease the people, he set up the Duma, also known as an elected parliament. But the parliament was essentially a powerless organization. The Tsar persisted in his old ways. Seeing no change, the Tsarist government faced opposition from the social revolutionaries, liberals, and the radicals. The social revolutionaries wanted land for the peasants. The liberals, on the other hand, wanted to share power with the Tsar. And you have the radicals who wanted to overthrow the Tsar and establish a new form of government known as Communism in Russia. Lenin was a radical who belonged to a group known as the Bolsheviks. He wanted to create a classless society where everyone was equal. However, the army still remained loyal to the Tsar, and it was not possible to overthrow him. The turning point came in 1914 when Russia entered the war. By 1917, it became apparent that Russia was struggling to keep up the war efforts. Many Russians grew even more unhappy because of the heavy losses in the war and the poor economic conditions. This time, it became clear that it was not just the peasants and workers, but the soldiers who had lost faith in the Tsar. The Tsar, in a bid to win the support of his soldiers, decided to lead his men in the war. He left his wife in charge of the country while he was away fighting. The Tsar's wife was a German, and many disliked her as they suspected her of passing on war secrets to Germany. They believed that the Tsar's wife was responsible for Russia's numerous defeats in the war. The Tsar was an incompetent military leader, and he led his soldiers to death. His soldiers began to desert the army. Still others refused to stand by the emperor. Following his failure in the war, he returned home only to face strikes, rebellions, and uprisings throughout Russia. The workers refused to work, and the soldiers refused to fight. In February 1917, a revolution took place in Russia, calling for the Tsar to step down. The Tsar had no choice but to abdicate. A provisional democratic government led by Prince Lvov and War Minister Alexander Kerensky was set up. The provisional government carried out some improvements. However, it failed to make land reforms and improve the working conditions of the workers. To make matters worse, it failed to end the war. The people continued to suffer and grew disappointed with the government. Lenin, the Bolshevik leader, used the opportunity to rally the support of the people. He promised them the three things they desired the most: peace, bread, and land. The people were swayed by the Bolsheviks and joined them in a second revolution in October to overthrow the provisional government. The Bolsheviks set up a communist government in its place. As promised, the Bolsheviks signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Germans and ended Russian participation in the war.